When Donald Trump exited the White House for the last time, the cameras captured every second the salute to Marine One, the wave to the crowd, the final climb up the steps. Then the engines roared, and he was gone. But unlike the dozens of presidents before him, Trump's story didn't end with a library dedication or a string of memoir interviews. There was no retirement tour, no self-congratulatory book deal, no teary farewell to politics. Instead, Trump did something unexpected. He disappeared. Weeks passed without tweets, without televised speeches, without interviews on sympathetic networks. His absence was so profound that it sparked wild rumors. Was he in exile, plotting revenge, or simply defeated? The truth was far more unsettling. Behind the veil of silence, Trump had entered a phase his closest allies privately called the retreat. It wasn't a withdrawal, it was a recalibration. Trump had seen something most others hadn't: the futility of traditional political warfare in the 21st century. Legislation, elections, policy battles, these were battles fought on the surface. But the real war, the one that would define the next era of power, was not in parliaments or courts. It was in narratives, in media, in information. Public perception wasn't shaped by policy, it was sculpted by the endless streams of news, entertainment, and social media. And if you could control the flow of information, you didn't need to win elections, you could win the world. While the media speculated on his whereabouts, Trump was assembling a team not of political strategists or legal experts, but of financial architects, tech magnates, and global investors. Men and women who understood influence not as a political act, but as a commodity. They met in undisclosed locations, private estates, international waters, encrypted calls shielded from surveillance. The plan wasn't merely to return to power, it was to own power, to control the channels through which public reality was constructed. News organizations, yes, but also entertainment companies, tech platforms, streaming services, digital ad networks. Wherever human attention flowed, Trump wanted a stake. But this would not be a gaudy acquisition spree plastered across headlines. The key was discretion, using layers of intermediaries, shell corporations, and offshore accounts. They began laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most complex private acquisition networks in modern history. Publicly, Trump was quiet, almost ghost-like. Privately, he was orchestrating. Old allies were contacted, not the ones too tainted by public scandal, but the quiet operator CEOs, media barons, financiers who owed him favors, or who shared his view that the world's narratives had become too fractured, too decentralized. They didn't call it manipulation, they called it alignment. A way to ensure that the public, so easily distracted and divided, could be guided toward a more stable, predictable consensus. One media outlet was an influence, 100 was control. But Trump wasn't thinking in hundreds, he was thinking in ecosystems. Television stations, news sites, podcast networks, streaming platforms, social media apps, the entire digital environment through which billions of people experienced reality. The first acquisitions were small: regional outlets, struggling media groups, independent news platforms, bleeding subscribers, harmless, overlooked. But they served as entry points, nexus points through which larger, more established networks could be accessed quietly, legally, invisibly. The second phase was more sophisticated: strategic investments in tech startups that controlled advertising algorithms, data aggregation, audience targeting, not the obvious giants Facebook, Twitter, Google, but the smaller gears in the machine that could redirect flows of information with a subtlety too fine for public detection. Control wasn't about censorship or propaganda, it was about framing, shaping not what people thought, but what they thought about, what stories they saw, what events were highlighted or buried, what emotions were amplified or muted. Through the careful manipulation of attention, you could guide public perception without them ever realizing it. It was a lesson Trump had learned during his first presidency. When you controlled the narrative, you controlled reality, and reality, once controlled, was more powerful than any law or election. as the months passed. Trump's public appearances became rare and calculated. He wasn't campaigning. He wasn't rallying. He was watching, testing the waters, measuring the slow drift of public consciousness as the first effects of his invisible empire began to ripple through the media landscape. A subtle shift in tone here, a realignment of headlines there, a gradual recalibration of what counted as news and what didn't. By the time the world noticed, it would be too late. The walls would already be built not of concrete but of stories. And Trump would not need to run for office ever again. He wouldn't need the Oval Office, the Supreme Court, or the Senate. He would own something far more potent. He would own reality itself. And from behind the curtain of his so-called retreat, he would pull the strings not of one nation, but of a world too addicted to information to realize it was being fed precisely what he wanted them to believe. The retreat was not an end. It was an evolution. And Donald Trump, once dismissed as a fading relic of populism, was quietly becoming something far more enduring. The unseen architect of the modern mind. If the retreat was about planning, building the network was about execution. The idea was simple, but the implementation was a masterclass in subterfuge. Trump's team didn't target the obvious media giants, first CNN, Fox News, the New York Times. Those were institutions far too visible, too politicized. Instead, they pursued what one insider called the bloodstream, the undercurrents of information flow that fed the larger narrative beast. Local news stations, regional online publications, mid-tier international news outlets operating below the radar of regulatory scrutiny. Quietly, methodically, Trump's proxies began acquiring stakes, buying influence not wholesale, but drop by drop, until entire networks were webbed into the new ecosystem. The acquisition strategy followed a distinct pattern. Step 1, identify struggling media entities, those drowning in the chaos of the digital age, hemorrhaging revenue, losing audiences, desperate for lifelines. Step 2, offer salvation not through hostile takeovers, but through investment vehicles with clean, unaffiliated names, boutique private equity firms, shell corporations headquartered in tax havens, philanthropic media foundations with anodyne mission statements. Step 3, integrate gently. No editorial firings, no obvious shifts. Just quiet guidance, subtle recalibrations of priorities. Stories about global instability, the failures of traditional political institutions, the erosion of national pride. These became subtly more prominent. Content emphasizing individual empowerment, distrust of legacy elites, and the need for new leadership paradigms began seeding itself into the narrative bloodstream. Over time, these outlets became nodes in a larger, invisible network, each individually harmless, together formidable. From London to Sao Paulo, Johannesburg to Manila, Trump's influence stretched its tendrils. Wherever information flowed, Trump's network adapted. And the true genius lay not in dominating the news, but in owning context. It wasn't about telling people what to think. It was about defining the boundaries of what could be thought. Algorithms were the next frontier. Trump's advisors understood that people didn't seek information anymore, they were fed it. Recommendation engines, social media timelines, curated news feeds, these were the real levers of power. Through carefully constructed subsidiaries, they began investing in the companies that built these algorithms. Not just platforms like YouTube or Facebook, but the companies behind the code, the firms that decided what you saw next. What stories appeared first? What opinions drifted to the top of your feed? Influence shifted from newsroom editors to data scientists quietly tweaking relevance scores. And Trump's network made sure it had a seat at the table. He didn't need to own the platforms. He needed to shape the parameters. The rules of engagement, what counted as trending, what was considered trustworthy, who was categorized as high authority. The moves were so incremental, so dispersed, that no single regulatory body could detect the pattern. Even governments sympathetic to free markets found themselves blind to the consolidation. No laws were broken. No acquisitions triggered antitrust alarms. The network grew, not by conquest, but by diffusion. By the third year of the project, Trump's fingerprints were everywhere and nowhere. Major global news events, the rise of populist movements in Europe, the crumbling of trust in global institutions like the UN, the volatility of emerging markets began to align neatly with the narratives his network subtly championed. It wasn't propaganda, it was narrative realignment. Audiences, bombarded with subtle, persistent themes, began to shift. Doubt crept into their trust of traditional authorities. Skepticism bloomed regarding supranational organizations, climate accords, global trade agreements. Faith in old political coalitions eroded. And everywhere, hovering just outside the frame, was the idea of strong, independent leadership. Leadership not bound by bureaucratic stagnation. Leadership willing to break the system to save it. The irony was exquisite. Trump, long painted as a destroyer of institutions, was now rebuilding the very notion of leadership itself, but on his terms. Meanwhile, rival political figures floundered. They fought battles on television screens and debate stages, while Trump fought wars in servers and social networks, in editorial algorithms and data centers. Their victories were loud and fleeting. His were silent and permanent. By the time governments realized what was happening, the network was too decentralized to dismantle. Ownership was layered, obfuscated, spun through enough legal entities and offshore holdings to make unpicking it a bureaucratic impossibility. Public disclosure laws were neatly sidestepped through investment partnerships, silent ownership stakes, and the strategic use of nonprofit media groups shielded by charitable status. The old empire's Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Viacom, CBS. The BBC looked increasingly brittle against this new, amorphous leviathan, because Trump didn't build an empire of companies. He built an empire of narratives, and narratives, once seeded into the bloodstream of culture, are almost impossible to eradicate. People don't just consume media. They live inside it. They absorb it through entertainment. Social media, memes, viral videos, podcasts, comment sections. Influencer endorsements. Reality itself is mediated through it. Trump understood this, and now he owned the architecture of reality, or enough of it to make sure that wherever public opinion drifted, it drifted toward him. Not overtly, not obviously, but inevitably. And the world, increasingly weary of chaos, division, and uncertainty, found itself gravitating toward the image he projected: order, strength, certainty. The building of the network was not a coup. It was a slow-motion annexation of the human mind. A campaign not for votes or approval ratings, but for the very lens through which humanity interpreted its world. And Trump wasn't running for office anymore. He was running for history. One acquisition at a time. By the time the public caught wind of what was happening, it was already too late. Trump's media strategy had matured from a web of scattered investments into something far more powerful, something insiders quietly referred to as the shadow conglomerate. It wasn't a corporation in the traditional sense. There was no headquarters, no board meetings, no annual shareholder reports. It was a decentralized, sprawling network of influence that extended its fingers into every corner of public life. From the movies people streamed at night, to the news alerts they woke up to the ads they scrolled past on their commutes, Trump's network had embedded itself invisibly but pervasively. The beauty of the design lay in its fragmentation. No single outlet dominated the landscape. Instead, influence was distributed across hundreds of seemingly independent channels, local news stations, YouTube personalities, TikTok influencers, mid-tier publications, entertainment blogs, podcast empires. Each on their own was modest. Together they formed a chorus that, without ever uttering Trump's name, began subtly realigning public consciousness toward his worldview. There was no need for overt propaganda. Instead, there was curation, carefully highlighting stories of bureaucratic inefficiency, constant emphasis on global disorder, and the failures of multinational institutions. Soft validation of populist leaders and nationalist movements. The conglomerate didn't create the waves. It merely adjusted the tide. Old-school media watchdogs were slow to recognize the shift. By the time they did, they were outmatched. Fact-checking was a rearguard action in a war fought with attention spans and dopamine triggers. The shadow conglomerate understood that control wasn't about disproving lies or promoting truths. It was about framing reality so that certain truths became self-evident and others became unthinkable. In entertainment, subtle narratives proliferated. Movies and series glorifying strong leaders who defied corrupt systems. Stories celebrating self-made individuals, overthrowing elitist cabals. Documentaries hinting at the dangers of globalism and the virtues of national sovereignty. Meanwhile, social media platforms found themselves increasingly driven by engagement algorithms that the conglomerate had quietly learned to game. Content calibrated to trigger anger, pride, nostalgia, the holy trinity of emotional engagement. Every click, every share, every like nudged the culture a fraction of a degree closer to Trump's preferred ideological climate. Internationally, the conglomerate expanded. Trump's proxies acquired stakes in emerging market media companies, quietly influencing editorial lines in nations where regulation was weak and public trust in media was already fragile. In Europe, skepticism of the EU grew subtly louder. In Asia, the virtues of sovereign leadership began surfacing in political discourse. In Africa and Latin America, a new narrative emerged, one painting traditional global powers as outdated, corrupt, and incapable of respecting local autonomy. All without Trump ever appearing on a ballot. All without Trump ever making a speech. He had become what few politicians in history had ever managed to be. A permanent cultural undercurrent, and he had done it without firing a shot. Within 5 years, traditional media powerhouses began to falter. Legacy newspapers bled subscribers. Cable news networks hemorrhaged viewers. Attention shifted to new platforms, new voices, new channels, all subtly aligned with the ideological gravity Trump's conglomerate had engineered. Even rival political movements found themselves reacting to the narratives his machine had set in motion. Campaigns against corruption, movements for national pride, skepticism of globalization. These weren't Trump's slogans anymore. They were the zeitgeist. Politicians who once mocked Trump found themselves parroting his themes, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes with a wink to the growing undercurrent they could no longer ignore. Culture shifted not in revolutionary leaps, but in evolutionary nudges. People didn't wake up one morning and decide to trust a different reality. They drifted into it. By the time they realized they had moved, they had forgotten the starting point. It was a slow, elegant capture of the public imagination. And the beauty of it all was that it required no centralized control. Trump didn't need to bark orders. The system was self-sustaining. Content creators chased clicks. Journalists chased relevance. Politicians chased approval. And all the while, the conglomerate's algorithms, influencers, and editorial nudges ensured that the chase led in one direction. In time, think tanks began publishing reports on the new information order. Scholars debated the rise of post-consensus reality. Regulators scrambled to draft policies on media transparency and platform accountability. But they were fighting the wrong war. Trump hadn't built a media empire. He had built a narrative ecosystem, and ecosystems don't topple, they evolve. Even when Trump himself faded further into the background, his ecosystem persisted, an invisible architecture shaping public thought, long after its architect had receded from view. The conglomerate wasn't about Trump the man anymore. It was about Trump the idea, an idea woven into the very code of culture itself. And culture, once changed, is almost impossible to reverse. The shadow conglomerate had no flag, no anthem, no face, but it had a grip on the world's imagination, and it wasn't letting go. For years, the shadow conglomerate operated in near-perfect secrecy, hidden behind layers of proxies and corporate shells, its influence as pervasive as it was invisible. But no system is truly airtight. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a peculiar way of clawing their way to the surface. It began with a single defector mid-level data, architect at one of the conglomerate's algorithmic investment firms, a faceless entity called Aurelius Systems. She didn't fit the profile of a whistleblower, no grandstanding. No public declarations, just a quietly mailed USB drive to an investigative journalist known for chasing phantoms no one else dared touch. The data on that drive was explosive. Internal communications mapping out ownership structures, algorithmic playbooks showing how news feeds were gamed to amplify preferred narratives, anonymous shell companies traced to trust, funds and jurisdictions famous for secrecy. Nevis, Seychelles, the Cayman Islands. The journalist, cautious but relentless, spent months verifying the leaks, cross-referencing corporate registrations, chasing down IP addresses, confirming insider names and timelines. When the first article dropped, headline simply, "The Invisible Empire," it barely made a ripple. The public, numbed by years of media fatigue, barely registered the revelation. But the leak had lit a signal fire for others. Soon, more whistleblowers surfaced. A marketing executive from a digital ad firm who had watched as ad buys were steered toward certain preference clusters that just happened to align with Trump's ideological themes. A former editor at a major online publication who had been pushed out after resisting subtle but persistent editorial realignments. A junior analyst at a data mining firm who had seen how psychographic profiles were built not to sell products, but to steer beliefs. The floodgates opened. A consortium of investigative journalists, scrappy independents, and legacy heavyweights alike banded together in a project they dubbed Operation Lighthouse. Their goal: map the network, expose its nodes, reveal its architects. They worked in secrecy, wary of digital surveillance, resorting to burner phones, handwritten notes, face-to-face meetings in parking garages and abandoned cafes. What they uncovered was staggering. The conglomerate wasn't just a collection of media properties. It was an ecosystem engineered for influence. Content farms generating thousands of seemingly independent articles every day, all nudging public sentiment subtly in predetermined directions. Influencer networks seeded with operatives who posed as ordinary content creators, but were on quiet retainers through advertising and sponsorship deals. Advertising algorithms tuned not just for clicks, but for emotional modulation, using data to target users at their most vulnerable moments with content designed to guide their thoughts gently but firmly. And always, behind the layers, the unmistakable fingerprints of Trump's original circle legal advisors, who specialized in shadow finance, media consultants who spoke fluently in the language of narrative warfare, political operatives whose loyalty to Trump was less ideological than strategic. Operation Lighthouse's findings, once published, shook the information landscape, but not in the way the journalists had hoped. The revelations were dismissed by the conglomerate's media arms as conspiracy theories, unverified hit pieces, elitist hysteria. Public trust in media was already so corroded that even credible experts struggled to gain traction. The conglomerate's brilliance lay not just in control but in delegitimization. By seeding distrust in the very concept of truth, they had immunized themselves against discovery. Truth, after all, was just another narrative. Still, the leaks kept coming. A trove of internal memos showed how entertainment franchises had been slowly steered, how film scripts and TV show plot lines subtly echoed preferred ideological themes. A classified playbook revealed strategies for manipulating search engine results show particular topics were algorithmically suppressed or elevated depending on their alignment with the network's objectives. One chilling document detailed contingency plans for shaping public response in the event of catastrophic global events, pandemics, economic collapses, wars. It wasn't just about reporting the news. It was about preparing the emotional landscape ahead of time. By the time an event occurred, the public would already have the appropriate narrative lens ready and waiting. The journalists found themselves targeted, their reputations smeared by anonymous leaks, their families harassed, their employers pressured by advertisers with shadow connections to the conglomerate. But the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted not about the conglomerate's existence, but about the world itself. Was anything truly independent anymore? Were ideas real, or were they artifacts of unseen algorithms? The more the public questioned, the deeper they fell into uncertainty. And uncertainty, Trump's architects knew, was fertile ground. In confusion, people crave simplicity. In chaos, they seek order, and the conglomerate was always ready to provide both. Not through mandates, not through decrees, but through gentle, invisible nudges. The perfect tyranny is the one you choose without realizing you're choosing it. And even as whistleblowers continued to emerge, even as the web of influence was mapped and remapped, even as expos filled digital airwaves, the conglomerate thrived. Because information isn't power anymore. Control of information is. And Trump's machine had mastered it. Operation Lighthouses. Final report concluded with a sobering line. In a world where every truth is manufactured, the only rebellion left is doubt. But doubt alone is not enough to dismantle a machine designed to feed on it. The conglomerate had been unmasked, but it had not been undone. And Trump, wherever he was, surely knew the first rule of narrative warfare is simple. Whoever controls the story, controls the world. The real genius of the conglomerate wasn't in how it controlled newsrooms, or movie scripts, or even social media timelines. It was how it understood something far more primal, the human mind's deep, almost biological need for certainty. As political institutions around the world floundered under the weight of polarization and gridlock, Trump's machine offered a different kind of leadership. That didn't come from ballot boxes or parliaments, but from the control of belief itself. Elections, once the sacred mechanism of democracy, began to shift subtly under the weight of that unseen hand. The conglomerate didn't rig votes. That would have been crude, obvious, detectable. No, it did something far more sophisticated. It shaped the electorate's reality before they ever stepped into a voting booth. Before candidates could craft platforms, the narratives were already built. Before speeches were made, public opinion had been preconditioned. Algorithms had learned not just how to feed people content they agreed with, but how to steer their agreements over time. Micro-targeted messaging delivered just the right emotional nudges to just the right demographic clusters. Suburban voters weren't bombarded with populism, they were fed carefully packaged narratives about stability, economic prudence, national pride. Younger voters weren't told to reject progressive ideals. They were slowly guided toward skepticism of elite academic hypocrisy and performative activism. The conglomerate's data warehouses, stocked with psychographic profiles of millions, knew what each voter feared, what they hoped for, what they doubted in their most private moments. And public opinion, once the unpredictable chaos of democracy, became something more manageable, a variable that could be forecasted, nudged, and ultimately controlled. Elections in Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia began swinging unpredictably. Centrist parties collapsed. Populist outsiders rose. Anti-globalist movements surged. At first, political analysts blamed economic downturns, immigration crises, and cultural fatigue. But the deeper truth, quietly acknowledged by intelligence agencies behind closed doors, was that public consciousness itself had been shifted. Not by speeches, not by scandals, but by the slow, invisible drip of narrative control. In countries where nationalist candidates once had no chance, they now found themselves surfing waves of online support built not through grassroots movements, but through the conglomerate's engineered ecosystems. A mayoral race in a mid-sized European city would find itself influenced by subtle online campaigns reshaping local sentiment about sovereignty. A presidential election in a developing nation would see a political unknown rise to power on a platform suspiciously aligned with Trumpist principles, distrust of multinational organizations, emphasis on national pride, skepticism of the global economy. And through it all, Trump himself remained absent. No rallies, no interviews, no endorsements. He didn't need to be present. His presence had been abstracted into a pattern, a template, a model of leadership that others could assume without even realizing it. As election after election swayed unpredictably, the global political landscape fragmented, old alliances weakened. International cooperation shrank, trade agreements unraveled, each country, increasingly consumed by internal populist narratives, turned inward. Nationalism was no longer a dirty word, it was rebranded as pragmatism, as self-respect, as defense against chaos, and every turn inward, every rejection of globalism, strengthened the conglomerate's true goal, a world fractured, just enough to be ruled not by governments, but by narratives. Public protests, once spontaneous, began showing signs of preconditioning. Rally slogans mirrored conglomerate talking points, demands for transparency, for sovereignty, for the return to common sense, echoed across continents with eerie synchronicity. And when protests failed, frustration turned to apathy, population too exhausted by manufactured outrage cycles to resist the quiet encroachment of invisible influence. Regulatory bodies tried to fight back. Campaign finance laws were tightened. Social media transparency rules were enacted. But the conglomerate didn't need to break the law to win. It stayed within the letter of every statute while gutting their spirit. Influence operations shifted to dark money channels, untraceable PACs, and social media content laundered through layers of independent citizen journalists and viral meme factories. Every investigation into media bias or election interference ended in the same cul-de-sac, no direct fingerprints, no clear violations, no one to blame. The conglomerate had created a system of plausible deniability so intricate it was practically bulletproof. Even intelligence reports warning of non-state actor. Media manipulation read like academic thought experiments, lacking names, evidence, actionable targets. Meanwhile, the public was trained, drip by drip, to see such reports as partisan attacks, deep state fabrications, or elitist panic. The genius wasn't just that Trump's machine influenced elections. It was that it influenced the way people thought about elections, about information, about truth, about trust. Every institution that tried to resist governments, media, academia, was dragged down into the same swamp of public skepticism. And skepticism, once seeded, is hard to kill. It metastasizes, it spreads, it corrodes everything it touches. By the time political scientists began discussing the post-democratic era, it was too late. The idea that people were rational actors, voting on objective information, was a relic. People voted based on emotions, and emotions were programmable. Global democracy, that grand experiment of the last 2 centuries, didn't fall with a bang. It drifted into irrelevance, and the conglomerate didn't crown a new emperor. It didn't need to. The throne had been dissolved, the kingdom scattered. In its place was something harder to fight, an empire without borders, without armies, without flags, an empire of narratives, shaping public opinion, not just in one nation, but across the world, silently, relentlessly, irreversibly. And at the center of it all, still unseen, still unacknowledged, was the architect who had understood it from the start, Donald J. Trump. By the time the full scale of Trump's media empire was understood, the foundations of democracy were already cracked. Politicians could campaign, but their speeches were shouted into an ocean of noise already saturated by the conglomerate's narrative currents. Journalists could investigate, but their revelations were met with a public so numbed by manufactured skepticism that no truth could penetrate. Governments could regulate, but the conglomerate's influence was too decentralized, too dispersed, to ever be effectively reined in. It was no longer about influence, it was about ownership of perception. The world stood at a crossroads. On one side, a desperate clinging to old democratic ideals, the notion that rational debate and free elections could still guide nations. On the other, the new reality, one where belief was no longer a product of fact, but of engineering. Academic institutions, once bastions of critical thought, struggled against a tide of mistrust. Media outlets hemorrhaged credibility. Public discourse fractured into echo chambers so deeply isolated that citizens lived in entirely separate realities, unable even to agree on the definitions of words, let alone policy. In this climate, the conglomerate thrived. The question was no longer whether Trump had built an empire of narratives. The question was whether there was anything left to resist. Activists tried to fight back. Grassroots movements rallied for real news, for unfiltered democracy. Fact-checking sites sprung up by the thousands, desperately trying to re-anchor the public in objective reality. But each attempt only deepened the divide. For every fact presented, a counter-narrative bloomed. For every piece of evidence offered, 1,000 whispers of fake news drowned it out. Trump didn't have to direct these movements. He didn't have to lift a finger. The ecosystem he had constructed was self-sustaining. Every attack against it only made it stronger, proof to its adherents that the elites were panicking, that the deep state was desperate. The final, brutal realization dawned slowly. You cannot defeat a system that feeds on your resistance. And so the defenders of democracy faced an impossible choice: adapt or be erased. Some chose adaptation. New political figures arose. Fluent in the language of narrative warfare, they eschewed policy papers for viral videos. They abandoned long-form debates for memeable sound bites. They didn't argue facts, they sold feelings, and the public, exhausted and adrift, embraced them. The old democratic norms, reasoned debate, compromise, the slow grind of legislation began to look quaint, almost foolish. Why deliberate when you could feel the right answer? Why debate when you could sense who was on your side? Democracy didn't die. It mutated into a grotesque mimicry of its former self, still holding elections, still waving flags, still reciting pledges, but the soul was gone. What remained was a theater of consent, a ceremony of choice, where the outcomes were sculpted long before the ballots were cast. Intellectuals wept. Historians wrote somber essays warning of the death of reason. But their words floated on the surface of a society that no longer read them. A few, still hopeful, argued that the tide could be turned. That with enough education, enough transparency, enough resilience, the public could reclaim its agency. They founded think tanks, media cooperatives, grassroots movements. They spoke of civic literacy, of rebuilding trust, of a second enlightenment. But Trump's empire had baked something deeper into the culture. A cynicism so pervasive it corroded every attempt at reconstruction. The cynicism that said everyone's lying. The cynicism that whispered, nothing is real. The cynicism that eroded not just faith in institutions, but in the very possibility of truth. Can democracy survive such cynicism? Some said yes, pointing to the cycles of history, how republics have fallen before and risen again. Others said no, warning that this was different. That once you lose faith in the idea of truth itself, there is no foundation left to rebuild upon. And Trump, he remained silent. No rallies, no speeches, no declarations of victory. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to announce his triumph. He had become something rarer than a king or a president. He had become the author of reality. And in a world where reality itself was negotiable, the old dream of democracy was just that, a dream. The tipping point had come and gone, unnoticed by most. A slow, imperceptible slide into a new epoch, one not ruled by laws or ballots, but by narratives. And as the sun rose on another day of curated realities and engineered consent, a quiet question lingered, unanswered. If democracy is a story and one man controls the storytellers, was it ever really ours to begin with?